Story 1. The Orchard of Invisible Roots. The sun dipped low over the dusty plains of Kosala, casting long, amber shadows across the furrows of a land that had seen many seasons of drought and plenty. An elderly man, whose hands bore the deep lines of decades spent grasping for tangible security, sat beneath the sprawling canopy of a banyan tree near the Jetavana monastery. He watched the monks move with a rhythmic, unhurried grace, their saffron robes like flickering embers against the deepening green of the forest. His mind was a turbulent sea of calculations, a ledger of missed opportunities and the encroaching fear of a winter without warmth. He had spent his youth chasing the wind, believing that the accumulation of gold was the only shield against the inevitable decay of time. Yet, as the silver of age touched his temples, he found that the more he clutched, the more his inner treasury felt hollow. He observed the Buddha walking slowly along the perimeter of the grove, not as a king or a deity, but as a man who had mastered the subtle art of presence. The old man realized that his own life had been a series of reactions to external lack, never pausing to consider the soil from which his efforts grew. He began to perceive that the financial droughts of his later years were not punishments from a distant fate, but the natural ripening of a mind that had functioned on the logic of scarcity. The Buddha's presence suggested a different alchemy, one where the quality of one's internal state acted as a magnet for the physical world. He understood that every thought of greed had been a stone placed in the path of his own prosperity, while every moment of genuine generosity had been a seed planted in a hidden garden. The movement of his mind shifted from the frantic tallying of losses to the quiet observation of his own breath. He saw that the true nature of karma was not a system of rewards, but a profound law of resonance. To invite abundance into the twilight of one's life, one had to cultivate a spirit that was already wealthy in its capacity for peace. The merchant felt the weight of his anxieties beginning to dissolve into the cool evening air. He recognized that the intention behind an action was the invisible thread that pulled the future toward the present. If the heart was a vessel of lack, it could never be filled, no matter how much gold was poured into it. But if the heart was a fountain of contentment, the world would naturally find ways to sustain that flow. He sat in the gathering stillness, learning for the first time how to be a custodian of his own mental landscape. The transition from a life of grasping to a life of allowing was the most significant transaction he had ever undertaken. As the first stars appeared, he felt a strange, quiet confidence that his needs would be met, not because he had fought for them, but because he had finally aligned his inner rhythm with the generous pulse of the universe. The legacy he was now building was not one of coins, but of a clarified consciousness that viewed every interaction as an opportunity to sow seeds of merit. This was the secret of the later stages, where the harvest was not measured by the size of the barn, but by the absence of fear within the mind that occupied it. He reflected on the vast trade routes he had once navigated, the caravans of spices and silks that had once defined his worth. Now, those memories were like dry leaves skittering across a courtyard. He saw that his frantic efforts to secure his future had actually been the very thing that obscured it. By constantly looking toward the horizon of the next gain, he had neglected the fertile ground of the now. The Buddha's footsteps were light, leaving barely a trace on the earth, yet the entire world seemed to support his weight. The merchant realized that to walk through the world with such lightness was to be truly provided for. He let go of the mental grip he held on his remaining possessions, feeling a sudden expansion in his chest. It was as if a heavy stone had been lifted from a spring, allowing the water to bubble up once more. He understood that financial luck was merely the external shadow of internal freedom. In the silence of the Jetavana grove, He made a silent vow to no longer be a beggar of the future, but a king of the present. The ancient trees seemed to nod in agreement, their roots deep in the earth and their branches reaching for the infinite. He was finally home. He watched a beetle struggle over a root and felt a sudden surge of compassion that transcended his own needs. He realized that every living being was engaged in this same dance of survival and transcendence. His financial concerns began to seem small in the face of the vastness of the cosmos. Yet, in that smallness, they found their proper place. They were no longer giants that haunted his dreams, but simple matters of fact that would be handled with the same care he gave to his meditation. The evening grew colder, but the warmth within him only intensified. He knew that the seeds he was planting tonight would grow into a forest of protection for his old age. The path was clear, and the harvest was certain. Story 2. The Weaver of Silent Threads. The river Ganges flowed with a silent and primordial power, cutting through the ancient earth of Magadha like a vein of liquid silver under the watchful gaze of the moon. Along its banks, near the outskirts of Rajgir, a man of 50 years sat watching the eddies and swirls of the dark water. He had once been a master of granaries, a man whose word could sway the price of grain across 7 provinces. Yet a series of misfortunes had stripped him of his titles and his storehouses. He found himself in the autumn of his life with nothing but the clothes on his back and a mind heavy with the debris of his former glory. In the distance, the flickering torches of the Vulture Peak Monastery signaled the presence of the Buddha and his disciples. The man felt a pull toward that light, not for bread or for gold, but for an explanation of the void that had opened within his life. He began to contemplate the nature of flow and stagnation. He realized that his previous wealth had been like a dammed pond, stagnant and prone to the rot of ego and attachment. When the dam broke, he had felt devastated. But now, in the emptiness of his circumstances, he was beginning to see the possibility of becoming like the river itself. The movement of his mind was slow and deliberate as he examined the internal mechanics of his downfall. He saw that his identity had been so tightly bound to his accumulation that he had become a prisoner of his own success. The financial luck he now sought for his later years was not about rebuilding the dam, but about perfecting the stewardship of the current. He understood that karma was the quality of the vessel through which life flows. If the vessel is narrow and rigid, the flow is turbulent and destructive. If the vessel is wide and resilient, the flow is steady and nourishing. He reflected on the Buddha's teachings on the middle way, realizing that his earlier life had been an extreme of grasping, which inevitably led to the extreme of loss. To find stability in his elder years, he had to find the point of balance where effort meets surrender. He spent the night in meditation, watching his thoughts pass like debris on the river. He observed the impulse to lament his lost riches and the impulse to fear the coming morning. He let them both go into the current. In the stillness that followed, he felt a profound sense of clarity. He saw that the universe is inherently generous, but its gifts can only be received by a mind that is not already full of itself. His poverty was not a lack of resources, but a purification of his capacity to perceive the abundance that was always there. He began to see the river not as something separate from him, but as a metaphor for the divine economy where nothing is truly lost and everything is in a state of constant transformation. The luck of his later life would come from his ability to remain a clear channel for this universal energy. He understood that by serving the needs of the moment without the distortion of personal greed, he would always be provided for. The river did not worry about the sea, and the sea did not worry about the clouds. As the dawn began to touch the peaks of the mountains, The man stood up with a lightness he had not felt since childhood. He walked toward the monastery, not as a beggar seeking a pittance, but as a man who had discovered the true source of all provision. He realized that the merit he had accumulated through his suffering was a more stable currency than any coin minted by a king. His financial future was no longer a source of dread, but a canvas for the expression of his newfound wisdom. He saw that the true meaning of karma was the alignment of one's will with the natural laws of the world. By choosing to be a humble participant in the great flow, he had already won the greatest fortune. The journey ahead was long, but he was no longer walking alone. The river was with him, and the Buddha was waiting in the light of the new day. Every step he took was an act of faith, and every breath he drew was a testament to the inexhaustible wealth of a mind at peace. He noticed the way the dew clung to the grass, each drop a perfect sphere of light. He understood that the smallest things held the greatest value when viewed with a clear eye. The path to financial peace in the twilight years was not paved with gold, but with the profound realization that one is already supported by the very fabric of existence. He felt a deep gratitude for the loss that had brought him to this riverbank, for without it, he would still be a prisoner in his own granary. Now he was free, and in that freedom, he was truly rich. Story 3. The Potter and the Wheel of Intention. In the dusty outskirts of Shravasti, where the earth was a deep and bruised ochre, an aging potter named Haridatta spent his days coaxing shapes from the formless mud. His wheel was a heavy disk of stone that had spun for 40 years, and his hands were stained with the permanent residue of his labor. As the shadows of his life grew longer, a persistent tremor had begun to inhabit his fingers, a subtle vibration born from the fear that his strength would fail before his needs were met. He watched the monks of the nearby Anathapindika monastery pass by in a silent procession of peace, and he wondered how they could appear so nourished while possessing nothing. His own mind was a frantic loom, weaving together the threads of past debts and future anxieties until the fabric of his present was obscured. One afternoon, the Buddha walked past his workshop, pausing for a moment to observe the spinning stone. There was no speech between them, yet in that stillness, Haridatta felt a profound shift in his internal gravity. He realized that his struggle for financial security in his later years was like trying to stop the wheel by gripping the clay too tightly. The more he feared the lack of resources, the more his hands shook, ruining the very pots that were meant to sustain him. He began to understand that karma was not a ledger of external deeds, but the centrifugal force of his own habitual thoughts. If his mind was centered on the axis of lack, the world he created would always be distorted and fragile. He started to observe the movement of his mind with the same precision he used for his pottery. He saw that every thought of scarcity was a seed of poverty, while every moment of internal stillness was a seed of abundance. He practiced maintaining a state of equanimity regardless of how many pots he sold or how much grain remained in his jar. This was not a passive resignation, but a radical realignment of his energy. He found that when his mind was quiet, his hands became steady again. The pots he produced began to possess a luminosity and a balance that drew people to him from distant villages. They did not come merely for the clay, but for the sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the vessels. The financial luck he had chased with such desperation began to find him naturally, flowing toward him like water to a low point in the landscape. He realized that the wealth of his later years was a byproduct of the clarity he had cultivated within. He no longer saw himself as a victim of time or a beggar of fate. He was the master of the wheel, and the wheel was his own consciousness. The Buddha had shown him that the secret to a prosperous ending was to be found in the quality of the beginning, which was always the present moment. As the sun set over the plains, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, Haridata sat in the silence of his workshop. He felt a deep gratitude for the tremor that had once terrified him, for it had been the very thing that forced him to look inward. He understood now that the universe does not respond to what we want, but to what we are. By becoming a man of peace, he had become a man of plenty. The coins that now filled his small chest were merely reflections of the light in his soul. He watched the dust motes dancing in a stray beam of light and saw them as tiny worlds of potential. His later years were no longer a descent into darkness, but a slow and graceful expansion into the light. He had learned the ultimate craft, the shaping of a destiny through the refinement of a single thought. The stone wheel continued to spin, but the potter was now at rest. Story 4. The Caravan Leader and the Unseen Cargo. High in the rugged passes of the Himalayas, where the air was thin and the wind spoke in the voices of ancient spirits, an old caravan leader named Vimal sat by a small fire of dried yak dung. For decades, he had led trains of mules laden with salt, silk, and precious stones across the treacherous spine of the world. He had gained a reputation for his ability to navigate the most difficult terrain, yet now, in the twilight of his years, he felt lost in a landscape he could not map. His physical strength was waning, and the gold he had accumulated seemed to weigh more heavily upon him than any mountain load. He feared that without the ability to lead caravans, he would be discarded by the world like a worn-out rope. One morning, he encountered a group of monks traveling toward a remote hermitage, led by the Buddha himself. Vimal watched them ascend the steep slopes with an ease that defied their age and the harshness of the environment. He realized that while he carried his wealth on the outside, they carried theirs on the inside. He began to contemplate the nature of the cargo he had been transporting through the years of his life. He saw that his mind was cluttered with the memories of every bargain struck and every loss suffered, creating a psychic friction that drained his vitality. The financial luck he desired for his retirement was not a matter of adding more gold, but of lightening the load of his mental attachments. He understood that karma was the momentum of the mind's journey. If he continued to carry the weight of greed and the fear of poverty, he would eventually collapse under the burden. He began to practice a new kind of navigation, directing his attention away from the external profits and toward the internal state of stewardship over his own awareness. He saw that by holding on to his wealth with a closed fist, he had stopped the natural circulation of merit that sustains a person in their later stages. He started to give away his possessions slowly and deliberately, not out of a sense of duty, but as a way to free his own spirit. With each act of release, he felt a corresponding increase in his internal clarity and physical energy. He realized that the true luck of his old age was the absence of karmic debt. The universe began to provide for him in unexpected ways, as if the path itself were rising up to meet his feet. He found shelter when he needed it and food when he was hungry, often from strangers who were moved by the quiet radiance of his presence. He understood that the mind is the ultimate architect of one's circumstances. By clearing the debris of a lifetime of grasping, he had opened a space for a different kind of abundance to enter. He was no longer a merchant of goods, but a merchant of light. The financial stability he had once feared losing was now a natural part of his environment, requiring no effort to maintain. He sat on a high ridge and looked down at the valleys he had once crossed with such frantic purpose. They seemed small and distant now, like the concerns of a dream. He saw that his life had been a series of lessons in letting go, and that the final stage was the most beautiful of all. In the silence of the high peaks, he felt a profound connection to the Buddha's path. He knew that he would never be poor again, for he had discovered the source of the only wealth that survives the passage of time. His mind was as clear as the mountain air and as vast as the sky. He was finally carrying the only cargo that truly mattered, the weightless treasure of a soul that has found its home. The sun touched the snow on the distant peaks, turning them into spires of pure fire. Vimal smiled and took a deep breath, ready for the next part of the journey. He realized that the luck he had sought was simply the natural state of a mind that is no longer at war with itself. Every step was a blessing, and every moment was enough. Story 5. The Architect of Empty Rooms. The shadow of the great stupa at Vaishali stretched across the red earth like the finger of a silent giant, marking the passage of a lifetime. Vardhamana, once the most trusted keeper of the royal vaults, sat upon a weathered stone, his mind still echoing with the clink of gold coins and the scratch of a stylus on palm leaf ledgers. For 3 decades, his internal world had been a rigid lattice of calculations, a fortress built of numbers meant to safeguard against the unpredictability of existence. He had believed that by meticulously recording every grain of rice and every ounce of silver, he was weaving a safety net for his declining years. Yet, as he approached the final season of his life, he found that the very walls he had constructed to protect his wealth had become the boundaries of a self-imposed prison. He watched the Buddha sit in a nearby grove, surrounded by hundreds of followers who brought offerings of food and cloth, not because the teacher demanded them, but because the teacher's very presence created a vacuum of grace that the world rushed to fill. Vardhamana began to analyze the architecture of his own consciousness. He saw that his mind was designed for containment rather than circulation. He realized that the financial luck of his later life was not a matter of how much he could keep, but of the internal structural integrity of his soul. If his inner house was built on the foundation of fear, no amount of gold could make him feel secure. He observed the movement of his mind as it tried to solve the problem of his dwindling resources, noticing how it naturally defaulted to the logic of the vault. He saw that this mental habit was the true cause of his anxiety, a karmic pattern that had ripened over years of focusing on the finite. The Buddha's silent instruction was to dismantle the walls and allow the mind to become as vast as the open sky. Vardhamana began to practice the art of mental hospitality, welcoming even his fears as guests that did not need to be fed. He saw that when he stopped trying to control the flow of external riches, a different kind of wealth began to manifest. It was the luck of the aligned heart. He found that a neighbor would bring him fruit, or a traveler would share a warm cloak, not as charity, but as a response to the quiet dignity he was now cultivating. He understood that karma was the blueprint of the mind's house. By redesigning his internal space to be open and generous, he had changed the way the world interacted with him. The financial support he needed for his old age was no longer a mountain he had to climb, but a river he was finally willing to swim in. He spent his days in a state of contemplative relaxation, watching the thoughts of lack dissolve into the warmth of his new understanding. He saw that the universe is a living treasury, and the only key required to access it was a mind that had let go of the need to possess. His later years became a period of unprecedented ease, not because his vaults were full, but because his heart was finally spacious enough to hold everything and nothing at once. He reflected on the kings he had served, men who died in fear despite their empires, and he felt a profound compassion for them. He had discovered the only true insurance policy, the realization that one's external reality is the shadow cast by one's internal state. The red earth of Vaishali felt solid beneath him, and the air smelled of rain and jasmine. He was no longer a keeper of vaults, but a participant in the infinite. The luck of his later life was simply the natural consequence of a mind that had finally come home to itself. He sat in the twilight, a man who was truly wealthy because he no longer needed to be. Story 6. The Echo of the Open Hand. The ancient village of Nalanda was a place of deep wells and deeper memories, where the air was often thick with the scent of burning cedar and the sound of distant temple bells. An elderly woman named Sumana, whose life had been a long tapestry of service and simple living, sat on her porch watching the evening mist roll in from the lotus ponds. She was 65 years old, a time when many in her village began to worry about the thinning of their rice bags and the cold of the coming monsoon. Yet, Sumana moved with a quiet certainty that seemed to baffle those around her. Her mind was not a place of worry, but a chamber of clear resonance. She had spent her middle years as a midwife and a healer, giving of her time and her knowledge without ever keeping a tally of what was owed to her. She had followed the teachings of the Buddha from a distance, practicing the quiet observation of her own intentions. She realized that the mind is like a musical instrument, and the world is the hall that carries its sound. If the mind is tuned to the frequency of greed, the world returns a harsh and discordant life. But if the mind is tuned to the frequency of selfless contribution, the world returns a melody of support and abundance. She understood that her financial luck in these later years was the ripening of a field she had been planting for decades. It was the law of resonance in action. She did not have to seek out resources, for the resources sought her out. A family she had helped years ago would arrive with a basket of grain, or a young man she had comforted in his childhood would repair her roof without being asked. These were not random acts of kindness, but the natural return of the energy she had emitted. She observed the movement of her mind as she received these gifts, noting the absence of any feeling of debt or pride. She saw that her mind had become a clear mirror, reflecting the goodness of the world back to itself. This internal state of non-resistance was the true source of her prosperity. She realized that karma was not a distant judge, but the very fabric of one's own awareness. By cultivating a mind that was already satisfied, she had eliminated the vibration of lack that attracts poverty. She saw the Buddha one evening as he walked through the village, and in his eyes, she saw the same reflection of the infinite. He did not need to speak for her to understand that the greatest fortune of the later stages is the discovery that one is never truly separate from the source of all things. Her financial luck was merely a small part of a much larger harmony. She felt a profound sense of lightness, as if the heavy cloak of her individual identity had been replaced by a garment of light. She understood that the movement of the mind from the personal to the universal was the final transition of a wise life. In this state, there was no such thing as a lack of money or a lack of food, for the mind was already full of the entire universe. She sat in the darkness, listening to the frogs in the pond and the wind in the palms. She knew that her needs would always be met, not because she was lucky in the way the world understands luck, but because she had become the very thing she wished to receive. The path of karma had led her to a place of total trust. She saw that her life was not a struggle for survival, but a dance of manifestation. The seeds she had sown in the morning of her life were now providing a lush canopy for her evening. She was at peace with the flow of time, knowing that the source of her wealth was as inexhaustible as the river Ganges. Her mind was a sanctuary where the past and the future met in a perfect and abundant present. She closed her eyes and felt the resonance of the universe pulsing within her own heart, a silent song of plenty that would never end.